Did not start this process of escalation. The United States waged an economic war against Iran. The United States has to come to its senses. The presence of Iranian people in the streets of many cities, unprecedented in the history, a sea of humanity, has to bring the United States to its senses that if it wants to deal with this people, it has to deal with this people based on respect, not based on threat and not based on sanctions. Europe can play a useful role by informing the United States of the serious error in their analysis, that they should stop listening to clowns, that they should base their policy based on realities and not some illusions of some clowns who have ambitions elsewhere.
As I mentioned, when arrogance and ignorance are combined, it becomes very dangerous. Trump has people around him who have combined both ignorance and arrogance, and the result has been these mistakes. We hope that the lesson that has been given to them by the Iranian nation, that we are indebted to the people. They came up and with their presence, they showed that Martha Soleimani was a unifier, a unifying force in our people. And this unified force should show to the Americans that they have been mistaken so far. There are reports that Americans have not been killed there, but Iraqis have been killed. I do not have the statistics. The military authorities will announce the statistics. What is clear is that we have attacked an American military base in the region from which the attack on General Soleimani took place. This was a legitimate target from the viewpoint of the international law. This is a legitimate right of self-defense against a terrorist act, a terrorist military act. We did our legitimate action. We took our legitimate measures. We have given them our messages through the...
So you're watching live pictures there of the Iranian Foreign Minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, there talking to the assembled press after a cabinet meeting in the Iranian capital, Tehran. He said it's up to the US to stop its adventurism in the area. He said Iran didn't start this latest escalation. He said that the people, the Iranian people, have shown that Qasem Soleimani was a unifying force. Let's bring him back, Asad Beg. He joins us from the Iranian capital. Asad, so Javad Zarif talking there, but let's talk about the tweet he sent out earlier after the strikes saying, in fact, it was a rather diplomatic response, wasn't it, saying that this was a single proportionate response underpinned by the UN Charter and that this response is now concluded. So do you think as far as the Iranians are concerned, that's it?
Yes, as long as the United States don't retaliate. And that's what the Ayatollah Khamenei, that's what Javad Zarif, that's what President Rouhani are all saying, that as far as they're concerned, that this is over. They've drawn a line in the sand. They're saying to the United States, OK, you killed our general, we struck your bases, let's both save face. And it's actually giving President Donald Trump a way out. But if the United States retaliate, then the Revolutionary Guard have warned countries in the region that host United States bases that if an attack is launched against Iran from those bases, those countries become a target. They've also warned Israel. They say that they do not see a difference between Israel and the United States. So there's a threat of bringing Israel into the conflict. But although the United States has overwhelming firepower, we can't forget that Iran has the ability to change the face of the Middle East. They have militias, they have proxies in the region, in Iraq, in Yemen, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, in Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. But although Javad Zarif said that if the United States retaliates, Iran will have to respond, but proportionally, that this could escalate into a full-scale war if the United States takes action, military action against Iran.
All right, to Asad Beg, there in the Iranian capital. Asad, thank you. And in another development, the U.S. Federal Aviation Authority has banned U.S. airlines from flying in the airspace above Iraq, Iran and the Gulf of Oman. It says there's a potential for miscalculation or misidentification. Let's bring in Gabriel Elizondo. He joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Gabe, so we heard earlier on from the Iran Supreme Leader. Let's talk about President Trump's response, because a rather curious tweet from the president saying that all is well. So what can we read into that tweet, Gabe? And are we now seeing perhaps a pause and a possible off-ramp here for the Americans to diffuse this crisis?
Yeah, there's certainly a pause, because that tweet by President Trump was really the only statement we've gotten from anyone in high levels of the federal government and, of course, President Trump response to these missile attacks. We have not heard from the Secretary of State. We've not heard directly from the Secretary of Defense either. And Trump, it was rumored that he was going to address the nation late on Tuesday evening. That ultimately did not happen. It was just as Trump, and it was kind of peculiar Trump, where, as you saw it in the story we aired, it said, all is well, and basically saying, I will be making a statement tomorrow morning, meeting later on Wednesday morning. And that is pretty much it. Trump is really facing a question now and a big, big decision. He has already said previously that if Iran struck any military asset, U.S. military assets in the region, the U.S. would strike back. Well, now Iran has struck U.S. interests in the region with these two bases there where some troops are at. No U.S. troops apparently were killed. However, now Trump has to decide, am I going to follow through? Am I going to strike back at Iran again or not? Was this severe enough attack by Iran to warrant another U.S. response or not? Those are the big questions, and we just simply don't have the answers to that yet until we hear more from Trump later on Wednesday. Now, I need to just mention briefly, the Pentagon is not confirming any sort of reports yet on how many missiles hit the bases, any sort of damage assessment. All of that is happening now. We have heard some numbers from the Iraqi government officials, but so far the Pentagon is keeping very quiet on this. They're assessing everything. We expect to hear more on the damage to the bases on Wednesday, and that will be critical, I will say, to see if any military assets from the U.S. were damaged or hit at all. That might play into any sort of American response going forward.
Yeah, Gabe, as you say, we're still waiting then on that battle damage assessment going forward. But what is interesting and significant is that both U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and the Defense Secretary Mark Esper have said, look, they're seeking a diplomatic solution and don't want to escalate this crisis. So where are we now with any diplomatic efforts to try and cool this whole thing down?
Yeah, we have not heard a lot from many officials since these missile strikes occurred. We heard from some Congress people basically as it was happening saying, we're watching this closely. We hope everyone is safe. But in terms of where this goes from here, we haven't heard from a lot of people. Clearly, though, President Trump does have some options now. It's just a matter of will he take those options. He's going to be hearing two different things. On one side, he's going to be hearing from people saying this is the chance to de-escalate the situation. Now is the opportunity to take this off-ramp to maybe pursue some sort of diplomatic avenues. On the other side, he's going to hear from hawks, people that consider this an opportunity to strike back at Iran. One of those people is going to be Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. He spoke late Tuesday evening, and this is what he had to say. Listen carefully.
The missiles were launched from Iran at targets inside of Iraq, housing U.S. military personnel. The president has all the authority he needs under Article 2 to respond, and how he responds is yet to be determined, but he has that authority to respond. It was an act of war by a regime for the last 40 years. It's been a cancer in the Mideast. When they say they want to destroy Israel, they're not kidding. They're the largest state sponsor of terrorism.
So that's some of the advice Trump is getting from very close allies, and it's now up to the president to decide where this goes from here.
Gabriel Elizondo, live for us there from Washington, D.C. Gabe, thank you. Let's cross over now to the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, and join Simona Fulton. Simona, so we haven't heard any official response yet from the Iraqi government, but how will officials in Baghdad, where you are, be assessing the Iranian response, do you think?
Well, so far we've only had a very factual statement from Joint Operations Command saying that there were in total 22 missiles that were fired by Iran in direction of 2 bases where U.S. personnel are stationed. 17 of those rockets hit Ain al-Assad air base in western Anbar province, and the remaining 5 hit near an air base, not actually striking it, but hitting in the surrounding fields. Now, we understand that those 17 rockets that were fired at Ain al-Assad all fell inside the coalition headquarters, but as we mentioned before, the U.S. is still assessing the material damage, and there are no reports of U.S. casualties. And the statement also said from the Joint Operations Command that there were no Iraqi forces harmed in this latest attack. Now, of course, this is a very significant event here because we haven't really previously had Iran firing such missiles onto Iraqi territory. We did have over a dozen different rocket attacks over the past 2 months targeting such bases, but these rocket attacks were mostly attributed to groups such as Hezbollah brigades, which form part of the Iranian-backed Popular Mobilization Forces here in Iraq. And of course, there has been a lot of concern that these groups were acting on the behest of Tehran. Now, what remains to be seen is how the Iraqi government will react. Will they condemn these attacks, which are also a violation of Iraqi sovereignty, just like the U.S. strike that killed Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes? And we have seen very strong condemnation of those U.S. strikes coming out of the government, followed by calls by parliament for the withdrawal of foreign troops from Iraq. So, of course, there will be some pressure on the Iraqi government to mount a proportional response, perhaps also condemning these attacks, perhaps also taking measures to try to rein in some of the allies of Iran here inside Iraq. But all of that remains to be seen, and perhaps many feel that this is highly unlikely because throughout the response to the latest crisis, we have seen the Iraqi government steer closer to Iran and basically take the position of Tehran in its statements.
All right, Simona Fulton there from Baghdad. Simona, thank you. Well, the Iraqi militia commander killed in the same airstrike as Qasem Soleimani has been buried in Najaf. Hundreds of mourners gathered for the funeral of Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. He led the pro-Iranian Hezbollah brigades, part of Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces fighting against ISIL. Well, the group was behind the recent U.S. Embassy protests in Baghdad, as well as an attack on an American military base that killed a civilian contractor. Let's bring in Sultan Barakat. He's director at the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies at the Doha Institute. He joins me live on set here. Sultan, good to have you back. I mean, what's your assessment of the Iranian response? Because it seems that they specifically fired guided missiles at Iraqi targets and were very careful not to hit U.S. assets or kill U.S. soldiers. So is this an escalation or a very clever Iranian retaliation?
Well, I think it's the latter. The objective is to retaliate. They were left in a very difficult position. They had to do something. They could not just forget about what happened in terms of the assassination. And for me, it really reminds me of Trump's response back in April 2017, if you remember, when the Syrians, he drew a red line about Syria's use of chemical weapons, and then he had to launch all these Tomahawk missiles on the air base in Shairat. And then we found out that the base had been emptied, in fact, and it was probably kind of almost maybe agreed that this would be a phase-saving exercise, and now we move into the second phase.
Sultan, let's just quickly talk about Iraq here, because Baghdad is now caught in the middle of this fight between the US and Iran. Soleimani, let's remind our viewers, was killed on Iraqi soil.
Yes.
Iraqi bases suffered this retaliatory attack from the Iranians. So how difficult a position is Iraq in now?
Well, they are in a very difficult position, but also this offers them a great opportunity to recapture their sovereignty once and for all now since 2003. The Iraqi parliament has already called with majority, 170 vote to none, for all foreign forces to leave Iraq. And at the time, of course, they were targeting the Americans. But now that the Iranians have also used Iraq as a stage to retaliate, I suspect the call will now apply to all. And by all, both the
Sultan, just hang on there for a second, will you? Because we're just going to go now to the EU Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen. She's been talking about the Iranian response. Let's listen to what she has to say.
In areas of transport and energy, on neighborhood and migration, but also the economic development, the stabilization and the reconstruction the European Union is doing in this area. The European Union is dedicated there and very much engaged in this area, and therefore its voice is heard. We've looked comprehensively at the internal and external dimension of this issue to ensure that we act as effectively as possible. As you know, I'm now on my way to London. I shall meet Prime Minister Boris Johnson this afternoon. And of course, the situation in Iran and Iraq will also be a topic. It is in our mutual interest to build a new partnership between the European Union and the United Kingdom, one that will be enabling us to defend and strengthen our interests both from an economic and a security point of view. And I would like to hand over the floor now to the Asia VP.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Allow me to start by joining my condolences to the families of the victims of the tragic crash of the Ukrainian plane tonight in Iran. Now, on the topic of this morning meeting, I want to stress that the recent developments in Iran and Iraq and the whole region are extremely worrying, and we have had a very fruitful discussion at the College about what the Commission can do. One thing is clear, the current situation puts at risk the efforts of the past years and also has implications for the important work of the anti-Daesh coalition. The latest rocket attack on air bases in Iraq used by US and the coalition forces, among them European forces, are yet another example of escalation and increased confrontation. It is on no one's interest to turn up the spiral of violence even further. As an immediate next step, I have convened an extraordinary meeting of the Foreign Affairs Council for this Friday. We have to leave Croatia first, with the 28 member states. And we will discuss what the European Union can do in the short and the medium and long term to help to stabilize the region. We have been talking with the colleagues also on the situation, as you said, Madam President, of the JCPOA, which is today more important than ever because it's the only place where we can sit together with the Russian and Chinese to talk on a multilateral basis about many risks that we are facing. It's one of the most important tools of the non-proliferation and regional security. I invited the Foreign Affairs Minister of Iran to pass by Brussels. Maybe we'll have a meeting soon in order to together analyze the situation of this agreement in which the European Union has put a lot of effort in order to maintain it after the withdrawal of the United States. I am in touch with all participants as coordinator to keep the unity of the group of the European countries represented in the board of the JCPOA and the importance of the full implementation by all parties. I want also to stress the strong support to the Berlin process. It's the tool we have in hands in order to face the situation in Libya and now jumping from one crisis to another. Libya is closer to us. It doesn't take a risk of a nuclear proliferation or confrontation. But there we are maybe facing a watershed point. The situation is very dangerous. Yesterday we had planned to go to Libya together with the 4 ministers of the 4 European countries, Germany, France, Italy, United Kingdom. Finally, it was not possible due to the and the risky situation there. Instead, we had a meeting here in Brussels, and we are waiting for the...
So you're watching live pictures there coming from Brussels. The EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, Josep Borrell Fonteles, and also the EU Commissioner, Ursula von der Leyen. They're giving their response to the Iranian retaliation earlier this morning. Let's bring in back Sultan Barakat again. Sultan, so we've seen the Europeans respond. What do you think the US reaction is likely to be? I mean, we saw this rather curious tweet from President Trump saying that all is well. But let me ask you, do you think this is now a pause in the escalation? Are we now seeing this off-ramp that many people are talking about?
Well, I think you have to keep in mind that within the US, they're split as to whether the action of Trump was legitimate in the first place in terms of the assassination, or even necessary to keep the issues ongoing in the Middle East. Now, I suspect there will be, again, the same split will play out as they wake up in the United States. Those who think this is an opportunity to really have a go at Iran, and they will be supported by lobbies, including those who advocate on behalf of Israel and the United States, and those who think this may be an opportunity to draw a line and start to talk sense to the Iranians, in the sense that they now have had a tick for tack as far as possible, and now maybe we can move forward. A lot depends on the damage assessment that may come out. I suspect, and so far we've had no reports whether there have been casualties or not, but if there are American soldiers killed, the response will be very different from if this happened to be just a physical damage with some assets.
Sultan, what about other regional players like the Saudis, the Emiratis, Israel? I mean, the Iranians have threatened to hit Dubai, they've threatened to hit Haifa if this escalates. But surely those countries don't want to get caught up in a wider regional conflagration, do they?
No, they don't. And ironically, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have, over the last few hours, changed their position quite a bit. They now come across as the sound of moderation, wanting to talk diplomacy. There must be a solution for the Gulf security and so on. When only a few weeks ago they were really calling for American intervention. And I think really the fact that now Iran demonstrated its ability to reach those positions, that they have the willing, and if pushed, they will fire those missiles. And to say publicly Dubai could be a target is
Sultan, let's just squeeze in one more question before you go. Yeah. Is there still room and is there still time for diplomacy? I mean, what kind of diplomatic pathway do you see in terms of any effort that can take the temperature out of this thing?
I think there is, and there is no escaping some. Particularly, I think Macron maybe will step in and try and mediate between the two sides. The EU, the Germans in particular within the EU, have really come out on the side of the United States a little bit prematurely right from the very beginning of the assassination. And the UK, given its ties to the United States now, have really chosen to keep quiet, and we haven't heard any particular position.
Sultan, just very quickly, we've got 30 seconds. What happens next?
I hope that there will not be further retaliation from the US. I hope that the damage to the bases does not translate to killing many American soldiers. And as such, that this could be the crisis that we all needed in order to start addressing the bigger crisis and the bigger discussion in the region.
Sultan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, if you're just joining us, let's just quickly recap what's happened in the last few hours. Iran has fired more than a dozen ballistic missiles at 2 Iraqi air bases that host American forces. Iran has said it was in retaliation to the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Let's remind you, he was killed in a US drone strike last Friday. Well, in terms of response, the US president has reacted to the strikes on Twitter, saying, and I quote, "All is well." Missiles launched from Iran at 2 military bases located in Iraq. Assessment of casualties and damages taking place now. So far, so good, is what he had to say. And the other breaking news out of Iran, 176 people have been killed in a plane crash outside of the capital, Tehran. The Ukraine International Airline flight went down shortly after takeoff. Ukraine's embassy in Tehran says the plane suffered engine failure, and there's no suggestion this is linked with other events in Iran. All right, well, the news continues here on Al Jazeera after the stream. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching.
Talk to Al Jazeera. We ask,
were targeted in that military operation. Has this been addressed by Turkey?
We listen.
What is the proposal of Spain